In 1978, John Wayne Gacy posed for a photograph with Rosalynn Carter, the First Lady of the United States. He was wearing a Secret Service lapel pin that had been given to him as a courtesy. He was smiling. She was smiling. It looked like every other photograph taken at a political fundraiser that year. At the time the photograph was taken, there were already 27 bodies buried beneath the crawl space of his house. John Wayne Gacy was a building contractor, a Democratic Party precinct captain, a man who organized neighborhood barbecues and children's birthday parties. He performed as a clown at local events. He won civic awards. He was photographed with a senator, a congressman, and the wife of the President of the United States. His neighbors described him as one of the best they had ever had. He was also responsible for 33 murders, the highest confirmed body count of any serial killer in American history at the time of his arrest. And the question that forensic psychiatrists, criminologists, and psychologists have returned to for more than 4 decades is the one that this episode is built around. How do you hold both of those lives in your mind at the same time? How does a person live that way, not for days, but for years, without anything breaking? The answer to that question, and I want to be clear that it is a real answer, not a metaphor, tells us something fundamental about the architecture of the human mind, something that goes far beyond John Wayne Gacy, something that, by the end of this episode, will change the way you think about the people you see every day. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a Danish-American machinist, a World War I veteran with a reputation for being cold, demanding, and impossible to please. His mother, Marion, was warm and loving, but in the Gacy household, warmth did not count for much. From the earliest accounts we have, John Jr. spent his childhood in relentless pursuit of something his father would never give him: approval. He was not athletic enough. He was not tough enough. When he was diagnosed with a heart condition at 11 and had to sit out of sports, his father called him a sissy. When he brought home good grades, his father found something else to criticize. When he tried to be useful around the house, it was never done correctly. Developmental psychologists who later studied his case identified this dynamic as the foundation of everything that followed. Not as an excuse. The vast majority of people with difficult fathers never hurt anyone, but as the origin of a specific and extreme psychological need, the compulsion for external validation. For Gacy, being approved of by the world outside his home was not a pleasure. It was oxygen. By the early 1970s, Gacy had built himself into exactly the kind of man his father had never believed he could be. He ran a successful construction company, PDM Contractors, that employed dozens of workers. He owned his own home in the quiet Norwood Park neighborhood. He threw parties. He hosted barbecues. He had a circle of friends, business contacts, and political connections that extended all the way to the office of the mayor of Chicago. He was elected Democratic Party precinct captain for his neighborhood, a position that required being liked, trusted, and visible in the community. He volunteered with the Gacys, a civic organization that gave him yet another platform for the recognition he craved. He won awards. He shook hands with politicians. He had his photograph taken at every available opportunity, and he performed as Pogo the clown. He created the character himself, designed the costume himself, painted the face himself. He appeared at children's hospitals, birthday parties, community events. He was, by every observable measure, a man who had built exactly the life he wanted. None of this was performance. This is the detail that every forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Gacy eventually agreed on. The community version of John Wayne Gacy was not a disguise. It was a genuine identity. He truly cared about his business. He genuinely enjoyed the Gacys events. The civic awards mattered to him in the way they would matter to anyone who had spent a childhood being told they were not enough. The other version of him, the one that existed in a completely separate psychological space, did not contaminate any of this, did not touch it, did not even, in the way that most of us would expect, exist in the same mental world. The first documented case that points toward what Gacy would become happened in 1968 in Iowa, where he had briefly lived with his first wife. He was convicted of sodomizing a teenage employee. He served 18 months of a 10-year sentence. He was paroled, moved back to Chicago, and the conviction was almost entirely absent from his public record by the time he rose to prominence in the Norwood Park community. His first confirmed murder was in 1972. Timothy McCoy, 15 years old, a runaway from Michigan. Gacy later told investigators he hadn't planned it, that it had happened in a moment of confusion that he had then rationalized, contained, and filed away in the part of his mind where such things did not interfere with the rest of his life. What is remarkable, and what makes Gacy uniquely significant in the forensic psychology literature, is that between 1972 and 1978, he continued to build his public life in parallel. More awards, more political connections, more community events, more photographs. The two trajectories did not slow each other down. They ran simultaneously in separate lanes without apparent friction. At some point in the mid-1970s, John Wayne Gacy began painting. He was not trained. He used the kind of inexpensive supplies you find at a craft store, and what he painted almost exclusively was clowns, dozens of them, in various poses, various settings, but always the same face, the Pogo face, with the exaggerated smile and the costume he had designed himself. He gave the paintings as gifts. They hung in the homes of neighbors, friends, and business contacts. They hung in his own home, on multiple walls. After his arrest, investigators counted more than 24 clown portraits across the property at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. The paintings became, in the years after the arrest, some of the most analyzed artifacts in the history of American criminal psychology. They were studied by forensic art analysts, forensic psychiatrists, behavioral criminologists, and what they found, or rather, what they consistently identified as absent, is the detail that makes these paintings so difficult to look at once you know what you are seeing. In every painting, the clown's eyes are wrong, not obviously wrong, not in a way that would make you stop and stare if you saw it hanging in the living room in 1976, but wrong in the way that something in the back of your mind registers before your conscious brain catches up. A flatness, a disconnection between the warmth the smile is signaling and the absolute absence of anything behind the eyes. Forensic art analyst Catherine Ramsland, who spent years studying the paintings, described them as the most literal self-portrait in the history of criminal psychology. She was not speaking metaphorically. Her analysis identified a consistent pattern across every painting. The facial structure below the eyes, the smile, the cheeks, the exaggerated paint, signals joy, safety, warmth. The eyes signal nothing at all, not menace, not coldness, nothing. The absence of signal is the signal. What Gacy painted in canvas after canvas was the face he showed the world, and he painted it so many times and gave it away so freely and hung it so prominently in his own home that the only conclusion available is that he did not see what we see when we look at those eyes. He saw the smile. He identified with the smile. The eyes were just eyes. In one of the many prison interviews he gave after his conviction, Gacy said something that no one who was in the room ever forgot. It was said in passing, almost offhandedly, in the middle of a longer conversation. He said, "A clown can get away with murder." He was laughing when he said it. The investigators in the room did not laugh. Whether that was a confession disguised as a joke, or a joke that accidentally became a confession, or simply a dark observation with no self-awareness behind it. Forensic psychologists who studied the transcript across the following decades could never reach consensus. What they did agree on was this: it was the single most unguarded moment in any interview Gacy ever gave. For one sentence, the distance between the two compartments of his mind collapsed to almost nothing, and then he laughed, and it was over. The door closed again. This brings us to the psychological concept that defines Gacy's case more than any other: the difference between a disguise and an identity. A disguise is worn consciously. You know you are wearing it. You know there is something underneath it that the disguise is concealing. Ted Bundy, whom we covered in episode 2, wore a disguise. He knew his mask was a mask. He told investigators as much. Gacy did not wear a disguise. Pogo the Clown was not a cover story. It was an identity, as genuine, as emotionally real, as personally meaningful to him as the construction business and the political connections and the community awards. He was not pretending to be Pogo. He was Pogo, and he was also something else. And the two things coexisted without apparent conflict, without apparent awareness of each other, in the same skull. Psychiatrist Dr. Robert Denton, who specialized in dissociative disorders, described Gacy's psychological structure as the most functionally complete case of identity compartmentalization in the clinical literature. Not dissociative identity disorder in the traditional sense. There was no amnesia, no lost time, no blackouts. He remembered everything. He simply stored it in a compartment that did not connect to the rest of his functional personality. A room with no door to the hallway. 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, Norwood Park, Chicago, Illinois. A single-story ranch house on a quiet residential street in one of the most ordinary neighborhoods in the city. The kind of neighborhood where children ride bicycles to school and neighbors borrow each other's lawnmowers and no one locks their doors. Gacy had purchased the house in 1971. He renovated it himself. He was a contractor, after all. He added a garage. He landscaped the yard. He built a rec room in the basement. He was meticulous about maintenance. The lawn was always cut. The gutters were always clean. The house looked exactly the way a house is supposed to look when it belongs to a man who has worked hard for what he has. His neighbors described the property as one of the best kept on the street. Several of them noted, years later, and with visible difficulty, that they had always felt comfortable leaving their children in his care. Beneath the house, running the length of the foundation, was a crawl space approximately 4 feet high. Gacy used it for storage. He also used it for something else. Between 1972 and 1978, he murdered at least 29 people and buried them in that crawl space. Some in trenches he dug himself, some simply placed in the available soil. He used lime, told neighbors it was for pest control. The smell that occasionally permeated the house, he explained to anyone who mentioned it, was a plumbing problem. Most of them believed him. One neighbor helped him dig what Gacy described as drainage trenches. He did not ask questions. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 21. Most were young men he had hired through his construction business or encountered at a Greyhound bus station in downtown Chicago, where he was known to approach young people looking for work. They were, in the language of victimology, a population with limited institutional protection, runaways, drifters, young men from out of state with no one in the city who would immediately notice they were gone. When the crawl space was full, he began disposing of bodies in the Des Plaines River. 4 victims were found there after his arrest. The total confirmed count was 33. For 6 years, Gacy operated without serious interference. There were complaints. A young man who escaped reported the assault to police and was not believed. A mother whose son had been employed by Gacy's company filed a missing person report and was told her son had probably run away. The institutional failures that surrounded this case are as significant in their own way as the psychological ones. The investigation that finally unraveled the case began in December 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Peast disappeared after telling his mother he was going to speak to a contractor about a summer job. The contractor was Gacy. A detective named Joseph Kozenchak, who had developed a specific expertise in missing persons cases, began pulling on the thread. Within days, Kozenchak had obtained a search warrant. On December 13, 1978, investigators entered 8213 West Summerdale Avenue and detected the smell. By December 22nd, the first body had been found. Within weeks, the full extent of what the crawl space contained had become clear. Gacy was arrested on December 21st. He confessed almost immediately. He was, investigators noted, cooperative to the point of being almost helpful. He answered questions directly. He drew diagrams. He identified locations. He behaved, one detective later said, like a man providing a contractor's estimate, rather than a man confessing to 33 murders. The compartment, after all, was still intact. Even in confession, the 2 versions of John Wayne Gacy did not fully merge. John Wayne Gacy went to trial on February 6, 1980, in the Cook County Criminal Court in Chicago. The prosecution's case was straightforward: 33 victims, physical evidence, a detailed confession. The defense's case was more complicated, more ambitious, and ultimately more interesting from a psychological standpoint. Gacy's lawyers argued that he was not criminally responsible for his actions because he suffered from a condition that, at the time, was called multiple personality disorder, what is now known as dissociative identity disorder. Their argument was that a separate personality, a personality they named Jack Hanley, had committed the murders, while the John Wayne Gacy that the community knew had no knowledge of or control over what Jack Hanley did. It was a sophisticated legal argument. It was also, according to most of the psychiatric experts who testified, not supported by the clinical evidence. The trial featured what became one of the most significant psychiatric battles in American legal history. For the defense, Dr. Lawrence Friedman, a forensic psychiatrist from the University of Chicago, testified that Gacy showed clear evidence of psychosis, that the murders had been committed by a dissociated personality operating outside of Gacy's conscious awareness. For the prosecution, Dr. Jan Fawcett testified that Gacy was in full command of his faculties, that he planned deliberately, covered his tracks systematically, and showed no clinical evidence of a dissociative state. Both psychiatrists were credentialed, experienced, and genuinely expert, and both, from within their respective frameworks, were making defensible claims. This is the detail that the legal narrative of the trial tends to obscure. The psychiatric community was not divided because one side was wrong. It was divided because Gacy's psychological structure did not map cleanly onto any existing diagnostic category. He was not legally insane in the sense of not knowing right from wrong. The evidence of his meticulous planning and concealment made that clear. But he was also not simply a rational actor who had chosen to commit crimes. He was something the diagnostic manuals of 1980 did not have a precise name for. A person whose psychological architecture had developed in a way that allowed two completely incompatible lives to run simultaneously, without either one interfering with the other. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They found Gacy guilty on all 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death, 12 death sentences and 21 natural life sentences, the most severe sentence in Illinois history at the time. The speed of the verdict, 2 hours for 33 murders after a trial that had lasted 5 weeks, tells you something about how the jury processed the insanity defense. They did not find it credible, but the psychiatric community's response to the verdict was more divided. Several prominent forensic psychiatrists publicly argued that the verdict had settled a legal question while leaving the clinical one entirely open. Because here is what the trial could not answer. If John Wayne Gacy was sane, what does it mean to be sane? If a person can systematically murder 33 people over 6 years, bury them beneath their home, attend neighborhood barbecues the following weekend, receive civic awards, pose for photographs with the First Lady, and experience no apparent psychological distress from the coexistence of those two realities, what exactly is the boundary between sanity and its opposite? Gacy spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During that time, he gave extensive interviews to journalists, criminologists, psychiatrists, and at least one person who later wrote a book about the experience. He maintained his innocence in some of these interviews and admitted guilt in others. He remained, by all accounts, personable, articulate, and cooperative. He also continued to paint. The clown portraits, produced in his cell with materials allowed under prison regulations, became collector's items. They were sold at auction. Some sold for hundreds of dollars, some for thousands. John Wayne Gacy, convicted of 33 murders and awaiting execution, had a waiting list for his artwork. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10th, 1994. He was 52 years old. His last words, delivered to the warden who asked if he had anything to say, were, "Kiss my ass." Even at the end, the performance did not stop. Even at the end, there was a role being played. The John Wayne Gacy case fundamentally changed the way forensic psychology approaches what was then called the normal killer, the perpetrator whose external presentation gives no indication of internal pathology. Before Gacy, the forensic assumption was that sustained criminal behavior of this severity would produce observable cracks in the social surface. The pressure of maintaining a double life, the cognitive dissonance of living among people you were also victimizing. These things should show up somewhere. Gacy demonstrated with devastating clarity that this assumption was wrong, that the compartmentalization could be so complete, so structurally total, that no crack appeared. Not in 6 years, not even, by most accounts, in the final months before his arrest, when the investigation was already underway and the net was closing. In response to the Gacy case, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the division that had pioneered criminal profiling in the 1970s, significantly revised its methodology for identifying what it called the organized offender. The new framework placed much greater emphasis on behavioral consistency over time, community integration, and the absence of warning signs as a potential warning sign in itself. The person who shows no cracks, the new framework suggested, might be showing you the most important thing about them. In 1994, the year of Gacy's execution, the state of Illinois attempted to destroy the remaining clown portraits in its possession. A coalition of artists and civil liberties advocates challenged the destruction in court, arguing, successfully as it turned out, that the paintings had artistic and historical value independent of who created them. The debate that followed was not really about the paintings. It was about us, about what it means to be fascinated by an object created by someone who did terrible things, about whether that fascination is morbid or legitimate, about what we are actually seeking when we buy a painting made by a man who was waiting to be executed for 33 murders. The paintings sell today, at auction, through dealers, through private collectors, for prices ranging from $5,000 to $20,000. The buyers are not, by and large, people who celebrate what Gacy did. They are, as far as researchers have been able to determine, people who are trying to understand something about evil, something about normalcy, something about the gap between the face in the painting and the face they imagine was behind it. Forensic psychologist Dr. Scott Bond, who has studied the cultural phenomenon of serial killer celebrity for decades, argues that this fascination is not pathological. It is, he says, an attempt to understand something that resists understanding, to find the seam in the fabric, the place where the normal life and the hidden one are stitched together. We keep looking at the paintings because we keep believing that if we look long enough, we will see it. We will find the place where the mask meets the face. So far, no one has. The Gacy case also produced significant changes in American law enforcement practice. The most consequential of these was a shift in how missing persons reports involving young men were handled. Before Gacy, missing persons reports for males over the age of 14 were routinely deprioritized, the assumption being that young men who disappeared had likely left voluntarily. After Gacy, the FBI and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children pushed for protocols that treated all missing persons reports as potentially critical in the first 72 hours, regardless of age or gender. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the fact that it took 33 deaths to produce that change. There is something equally uncomfortable about acknowledging that several of those deaths might have been prevented if the complaints and reports that preceded Gacy's arrest had been taken seriously. The young man who escaped and reported the assault, the mothers of the missing, the people who noticed the smell and accepted the explanation. The failure was not individual, it was systemic, and the system has, in the years since, attempted to learn from it. Whether it has learned enough is a question that every subsequent case of this kind reopens. John Wayne Gacy was not the last person to live this way. In the decades since his arrest, researchers who study what is now called the hidden offender profile, the person whose criminal behavior is structurally invisible to their social environment, have identified the pattern in case after case. Dennis Rader, known as BTK, was a church president, a Boy Scout leader, and a compliance officer for the city of Wichita, Kansas. He murdered 10 people between 1974 and 1991. His neighbors, his colleagues, and the members of his congregation had no idea. When he was finally arrested in 2005, the reaction in his community was not just shock. It was a specific kind of disorientation, the feeling that the categories you use to understand the world had suddenly stopped working. Scott Peterson, who murdered his pregnant wife Lacey in 2002 while simultaneously conducting multiple affairs and planning an entirely new life, was described by everyone who knew him as charming, helpful, and completely transparent. Robert Durst, who investigators believe killed at least 3 people over 3 decades, socialized with the wealthy families of Manhattan and Beverly Hills for years while hiding what he had done. The pattern is consistent enough that forensic psychologists have given it a clinical name: pseudo-community integration. The subject is not pretending to be part of the community. They are genuinely part of it, contributing to it, being valued by it, deriving real satisfaction from it. The crimes exist in a sealed-off psychological space that does not communicate with the social identity. And the social identity, because it is genuine, produces no behavioral cues that would alert the people around them. Modern neuroscience has begun to offer partial explanations for how this architecture is possible. Brain imaging studies of individuals with extreme compartmentalization, conducted primarily with incarcerated populations, show patterns of neural connectivity that differ from typical populations in specific and reproducible ways. The connections between the prefrontal cortex, which handles planning and executive function, and the limbic system, which processes emotion and social bonding, show unusual independence in these individuals. They can plan without feeling. They can feel, genuinely feel, in the contexts that matter to them, without that feeling accessing the planning system. This is not a defect in the conventional sense. It is an architecture, one that can produce, in the right environment, exactly what we see in Gacy: a person who is simultaneously a genuinely engaged member of their community and something else entirely, not because they are pretending in one domain, but because the 2 domains are structurally isolated from each other. Here is what the research tells us. As of today, we do not have a reliable way to detect this. There is no behavioral marker that is specific enough, sensitive enough, or practically deployable enough to identify the hidden offender before the harm is done. The warning signs that exist in retrospect, the inconsistencies, the over-explanation, the specific patterns of social behavior, are not detectable in real time without information that is not available in real time. The person who helped Gacy dig trenches in his crawl space was not naive. He was not careless. He was a normal person who trusted a neighbor he had known for years, for reasons that were entirely rational given the information available to him. The people who attended the barbecues were not missing something obvious. There was nothing obvious to miss. And that is the most important thing this case has to teach us. Not about John Wayne Gacy, about the limits of what we can know about another person from the outside, about the gap between the self that is presented and the self that exists in rooms no one else is ever invited into, about the possibility, uncomfortable, persistent, and supported by the evidence, that this gap is not the exception in human psychology. It is, to varying degrees, the rule. We began this episode with a photograph, a man smiling next to the First Lady of the United States, 27 bodies already in the ground beneath his house. We have spent 34 minutes trying to understand how that is possible, and the honest answer, the one the science keeps returning to, is that it is possible because the human mind is capable of a degree of internal separation that most of us, from the inside of our own integrated experience, cannot quite imagine. In this series, we have looked at 4 cases, The Zodiac used fear as power. Bundy simulated humanity. Dahmer tried to keep people from leaving. And Gacy built two lives so completely separate that neither one knew the other existed. 4 different mechanisms, 4 different psychologies, and underneath all of them, the same question. What does it mean to know another person? What does proximity actually give us? What are we missing every day in the people we think we understand? If this series is asking you something, and I think it is, that is the question. Not about killers, about knowledge, about the limits of what another person's surface can tell you about what is underneath. Subscribe. Every week, one case, one mind, one pattern, and always the question that does not have a comfortable answer.